following is the Black Mountains Gliding Club Airfield briefing. The briefing is a guide on what to expect when flying from this airfield and does not replace an actual walk round that must be done with an approved instructor, especially if this is your first time to the airfield. So let's have a look in a bit more detail. In general, we'd like you to start the day by attending the daily briefing at 10 o'clock. If this is not possible, then at least make sure you speak to the duty instructor. Preferred circuit at this site is generally to the north side of the airfield, which gives you greater options. However, this is not safe to do so. A circuit to the south is perfectly okay, it just has less options. Whenever you commence your circuit, please make a radio call declaring your aircraft registration and which circuit you are intending to do with the landing area. The approach at Talgarth requires at least half to two-thirds air brakes with no shallowing approaches. Now let's have a look at the runways in some detail, starting with the northwest runway. Most of our launches are carried out in this direction. If you are now looking at doing all clear above and behind, then just be aware that gliders could be blocked from view on the southern side of the airfield if they are doing a left-hand circuit, something to watch for. On the takeoff run itself, you start off flat, but then the runway itself starts going downhill. If there isn't much of a headwind, you could find yourself airborne with the tug still on the ground and you having to follow the curvature of the earth until the tug gets airborne. Again, something to look for. Landing in this direction is a northwest over the gate radio call. Depending on your glider, you should need at least 15 knots on those, as the landing area is only about 200 meters long before it starts going downhill. Landing in this direction does require accurate circuit planning and speed control. There is no overshoot or undershoot. You would be approaching over hedges and trees, so you can expect turbulence, together with the circuit being quite close to the mountains, as it is the preferred circuit right hand, as it gives you more options. Now looking at the west runway, note that the takeoff run is slightly uphill before it goes back downhill again from about the road that goes across the airfield. If you are launching in a strong crosswind, particularly if it's a southerly going for southerly wave, then you can expect to get curl-over from the hangar and the trees. During the winter months, the ground can also be boggy, so that with a crosswind and an uphill slope could mean poor acceleration, which is something to be aware of. We do have an overshoot in this direction, but you need to be aware of the fact that it does go downhill and might have some sheep in it. We do land in this direction, between the trees and over the hedge. There is no undershoot, but the overshoot as just mentioned. As you'll be landing over the hedge and between the trees, expect some turbulence, which you need to be aware of. The preferred circuit is right hand, which gives you greater options. Now looking at our southwest runway, which we don't use for launching, but is our predominant landing run. Note that it has a reasonable upslope, which gets steeper before the runway threshold. You need to be aware of the potential sink and wind gradient, which could be quite pronounced with reasonable strength wind. If you do land close to the threshold, a more pronounced flare may be required because of the slope. You might consider having a couple of extra knots in hand to help you do so. Generally, we recommend putting the reference point about 30 yards in from the threshold, where the slope is less pronounced. If your glider has poor approach control and or has a lot of energy, then use the threshold markers as a reference point, as the slope will help kill the float. The runway has an overshoot of sorts, although you have to steer into it, as it is the same as used for the west run, and you need to consider the fact that it will continue going downhill and there may be sheep and or an electric fence. The preferred circuit is right hand, as it gives you the most options available. Now moving to the southeast run, we don't launch in this direction. On landing there is no overshoot or undershoot. If you are landing in quite strong southerly wave conditions, you can experience turbulence on the circuit and approach with associated sink. There is an uphill slope, but it's less pronounced than the southwesterly and can give the illusion that you are overshooting, you're too high on the approach, when actually you are not. There's something to watch for. The preferred circuit is right hand for greater options. While standing at the southeast threshold, we can have a look down into the valley floor for your launch failure field options. Note that the valley floor obviously is lower, which gives you additional time if you have a launch failure. If you do suffer a launch failure, do go straight ahead and pick the nearest available landing field. Do not consider turning back to the airfield unless it is absolutely safe to do so. Whenever you maneuver, keep the string in the middle and maintain your recovery speed. Now to our final run, launching northeast, landing east. Launching northeast is slightly uphill and then it goes down a hill again. Once safely airborne, you can expect a hard turn to the left. This might just be as you enter the rotor if you have strong easterly wave present. Be aware. The preferred circuit is left hand to the north of the airfield for better options. Landing east has a slight upslope, and just like the southeast run, could give you the perspective that you're too high. There is no overshoot, and when landing, you have a slight upslope before it starts going downhill from about the centre of the airfield onwards. Something to be aware of if you have a long float. If you are flying an easterly wave, as mentioned, you could hit the rotor within about the first 100 foot or so on the toe, which is just at the point where you might be turning left away from the mountains. You could also experience quite strong rotor in the circuit, and we generally start our circuit much higher, in the region of about 1500 feet, although you'll get a separate briefing for this. The rotor can continue right round onto the approach, where you can experience quite strong sink. So again, generally we start the approach higher than you would expect. But as mentioned before, you will get a thorough briefing on the day because of the strong and changing conditions that we can experience. Whenever you land east, be aware that the electric fence on the boundary could be up, and it's something to be aware of. That concludes the walk round briefing. Now move on to the airborne videos, which can be found on the Black Mountains Gliding Club website, and these include airborne demonstrations of the launch, circuit landing southwest, northwest and east, launch failures landing into the valley, as well as general airborne site briefings, part 1, 2 and 3, including soaring the southwest bowl and the Kundu Valley.